When you hear the name Vlad the Impaler, you probably think of one thing: Dracula. You picture the cape, the fangs, the castle shrouded in mist, a gothic fantasy, a creature of the night. But that story is a comfortable lie. A bedtime story told to hide a reality so grotesque, so systematically brutal, that a simple monster who drinks blood seems like a welcome relief. Forget the vampire. The man was infinitely more terrifying. His real name was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, son of the dragon. To his enemies, he was Kazikla Voivode, the Impaler Lord. He was not a creature of supernatural fiction. He was a nightmare made of flesh and bone, a product of a violent age who perfected cruelty as an instrument of statecraft. He ruled a tiny, blood-soaked chessboard of a kingdom, wedged between the ambitions of two colossal empires, the Kingdom of Hungary and the ever-expanding Ottoman Sultanate. To survive was to be brutal. But Vlad chose to be something else entirely. He chose to be a weapon. This is not another Dracula story. We will not be exploring crumbling castles for sleeping vampires. We are going on a far more disturbing journey. We are going to dissect the mind of the monster and the world that created him. We will uncover the brutal, raw truth that the Gothic novels were too afraid to touch. We will explore how he turned human suffering into political theater, and how he weaponized fear with a genius that was as breathtaking as it was diabolical. This isn't just about what he did. It's about why. It's about how a man could look upon the absolute horror of impalement, a slow, agonizing death that could last for days, and see not just an execution, but a message, a political statement, a tool for nation building. Our journey begins not on the battlefield, but in a gilded prison, where a boy prince learned his first and most important lesson, that thrones are kept not with loyalty, but with terror. We will witness the bloody Easter feast where he broke the power of his nobles, not with policy, but with splintered wood and mass graves. We will walk through his horrifying masterpiece, The Forest of the Impaled, a psychological masterstroke that defeated an army without a single sword being drawn. This is the story of how a boy hostage became a king, and how that king became a devil in order to save his people. Or so he told himself. To understand the monster, you must first understand the forge that created him. Wallachia in the 15th century was not a kingdom. It was a blood-soaked anvil, perpetually caught between the hammer of the Ottoman Empire to the south and the shifting ambitions of Hungary to the north. It was a land of whispers and daggers, where a prince's reign was measured not in years, but in the number of betrayals he could survive. Loyalty was a currency that devalued by the hour. Power was a flickering candle in a hurricane, and the only way to shield it was to build a wall of corpses around it. This was the world Vlad III was born into. It was a world that did not reward kindness or honor. It rewarded only strength and the willingness to do what other men would not dare to even imagine. His father, Vlad II Dracul, was a master of this precarious game. He was a member of the elite Order of the Dragon, a Christian order sworn to defend the cross from the Ottoman Crescent. But defending the cross often meant shaking hands with the Sultan. Vlad II balanced on a political razor's edge, paying tribute to the Ottomans with one hand while plotting with the Hungarians with the other. It was a deadly dance, and in 1442, the music stopped. To secure a fragile peace and prove his loyalty to Sultan Murad II, Vlad II did what many rulers of the time were forced to do. He gave the Sultan a guarantee. He gave him his own sons. A young Vlad, around 12 years old, and his younger, more handsome brother, Radu, were handed over as political hostages. This is the moment the monster's education began. The Ottoman court was not a dungeon of chains and darkness. It was a gilded cage, a masterclass in psychological warfare taught by the most powerful men in the world. The boys were treated with a veneer of respect, educated in science, art, and philosophy alongside the Sultan's own sons. But every silk pillow, every lavish meal, every lesson in swordsmanship was a reminder of their status. They were property. They were living, breathing collateral. Their lives were forfeit the instant their father stepped out of line. It was a slow-acting poison, a lesson in power dynamics taught not through textbooks, but through the constant unspoken threat of the executioner's blade. And here, in this opulent prison, the two brothers diverged. Radu, later known as Radu the Handsome, adapted. He was charming, intelligent, and saw the path of least resistance. He befriended the Sultan's son, the future Mehmed the Conqueror, embraced Ottoman culture, and eventually converted to Islam. He became a favorite of the court, a testament to the success of the Sultan's re-education program. Vlad did not adapt. He watched his brother's transformation not with acceptance, but with a simmering, impotent fury. He saw it as the ultimate betrayal, the first of many that would define his life. He was defiant, proud, and frequently punished for his insolence. Every lash of the whip, every day spent in that gilded cage, carved a single visceral truth into his soul. Trust no one. Not your allies, not your captors, not even your own blood. He learned to see the world as a collection of potential threats, of future betrayers waiting for a moment of weakness. He was learning to hate with a patience and a depth that would become his defining characteristic. Then, in 1447, the abstract threat of betrayal became a horrific, tangible reality. Word reached the Ottoman court that his father, Vlad II, had been overthrown. The rival boyars, the landed nobility of Wallachia, had colluded with the Hungarian regent, John Hunyadi, to seize power. They had ambushed his father in the swamps near Baltani and murdered him. But it was the fate of his older brother, Mircea, that became the blueprint for Vlad's future reign. The boyars had not simply killed Mircea. That would have been too merciful. According to the chronicles, they captured him, and in an act of breathtaking cruelty, they blinded him with red-hot iron stakes before burying him alive. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just a political assassination. It was a message, written in scorched flesh and suffocating earth. It was a statement of utter contempt. As Vlad sat in his gilded cage, this news was not just a tragedy, it was a revelation. It was the final bloody confirmation of everything he had learned to suspect. The world was not governed by treaties or honor. It was governed by brutal, visceral power. The boyars had taught him that to eliminate a rival, you must do it in a way that terrifies anyone who might ever dream of following them. It was a lesson Vlad would take to heart, and one he would later perfect into a horrifying art form. The boyars thought they were ending a dynasty. Instead, they were creating a devil. Years later, after a series of bloody struggles, Vlad finally secured the Wallachian throne in 1456. He was no longer the boy hostage. He was a man forged in betrayal and tempered in rage. And he had a very, very long memory. He knew the boyars who now bowed to him, who smiled and pledged their loyalty, were the same vipers who had murdered his family. They believed he was just another prince they could manipulate and eventually discard. They were about to learn how catastrophically they had misjudged him. For 3 years, he waited. He consolidated his power, he observed, he plotted. Then, in the spring of 1459, he decided it was time to settle the old debts. He invited hundreds of the boyars and their families to a grand Easter feast at his court in Târgoviște. It was a gesture of reconciliation, a sign that the new prince was willing to let bygones be bygones. The nobles arrived in their finest clothes, arrogant and self-assured. They ate his food, drank his wine, and laughed in his halls, believing their power was secure. As the feast reached its peak, Vlad rose to speak. The hall fell silent. According to a popular and likely very true account, he looked out at the assembled nobles and asked a simple, chilling question. "How many princes," he asked, his voice calm, "has your generation known?" A nervous shuffling filled the hall. One old boyar, perhaps emboldened by wine, stood and boasted that he had seen dozens of princes come and go. Others followed suit, each trying to outdo the other, listing the many rulers they had served and, by implication, had outlived. They thought they were impressing him with their experience and longevity. They were, in fact, signing their own death warrants. When they had finished, Vlad's calm demeanor shattered. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the cold fury beneath. He told them he knew who they were. He knew they were responsible for the instability of the kingdom, for the endless cycle of betrayal. They were the disease, the rot that had killed his father and brother. And he was the cure. His soldiers, who had been waiting for the signal, stormed the hall. The feast turned into a slaughter. The boyars were seized, their fine clothes no protection against cold steel. But Vlad did not simply kill them. That was not his way. His revenge had to be symbolic. It had to be poetic in its cruelty. The oldest and most powerful boyars, the ones who had boasted of outliving so many princes, were taken outside the city walls. There, they were met with sharpened stakes. They were impaled on the spot, their dying groans serving as the evening's entertainment. Their punishment was a direct answer to their crime. They had brought instability and death to the throne, and now they would die a slow, agonizing public death. But for the younger, healthier boyars and their families, he had a different fate in mind. His revenge was not just about death, it was about humiliation and servitude. He had a project for them, a new fortress overlooking the Argesh River, a place that would become known as Poenari Castle. He marched them, still in their festive Easter clothes, on a grueling journey over 50 miles through the mountains. Many died along the way from exhaustion and exposure. Those who survived were put to work. They were forced to quarry stone, haul timber, and build the fortress with their bare hands, lord and lady alike, until their fine clothes were reduced to rags and the flesh was stripped from their bones. They worked until they dropped dead from exhaustion, their bodies mixed in with the mortar of the castle walls. This was the true birth of Vlad the Impaler. The Easter feast was his declaration of intent. He was not just another prince the boyars could control. He was an absolute power, a force of nature. He had purged the old guard, not with political maneuvering, but with visceral, unforgettable horror. He had built his fortress, his symbol of power, literally on the bones of his enemies. He had taken the lesson they taught him when they buried his brother alive, and he had turned it back on them, magnified 1,000 times over. The seeds of violence, planted in him as a boy hostage, had finally borne their terrifying fruit. The Easter massacre was not an act of blind rage. It was a calculated statement of intent, a grand, bloody inauguration of a new political philosophy. With the old guard of the boyars either impaled or worked to death, Vlad had a blank slate. He could now build his kingdom in his own image, and the foundation of that kingdom would be one simple, unshakable principle: absolute, terrifying order. Vlad the Impaler's reign was not merely a reign of terror, it was a reign by terror. He understood perhaps better than any ruler of his time, that fear was not just an emotion, it was a tool, it was a currency. And in a land as treacherous as Wallachia, it was the only currency that never lost its value. He embarked on a radical program of social and economic engineering, and his primary policy instrument was the sharpened stake. He was obsessed with eradicating crime and corruption, not out of a sense of moral justice, but because he saw them as symptoms of the same disease that had killed his father. Weakness, dishonesty, theft, laziness, these were all forms of internal betrayal, cracks in the foundation of his state, and he would seal those cracks with blood. The stories of his brutal justice became legendary, passed down in hushed whispers across his kingdom and beyond. They were designed to be memorable, to be shocking, to create a personal, visceral connection between a crime and its unimaginable consequence. It was one thing to hang a thief. It was another thing entirely to create a spectacle of agony so profound that the mere thought of stealing would make a man's stomach turn to ice. Take, for instance, his war on poverty and vagrancy. According to German and Russian chronicles, which were admittedly hostile propaganda but likely rooted in a kernel of truth, Vlad rounded up all the sick, the poor, and the beggars of Wallachia for another one of his grand feasts. He brought them to a great hall, gave them all the food and wine they could desire, and asked them a chilling question. Do you want to be without cares, lacking nothing in this world? When they eagerly cried yes, he ordered the hall boarded up and set it on fire, burning them all alive. As he watched the flames consume them, he is said to have remarked that he was doing it so that they would no longer be a burden to other men and so that no one would be poor in my realm. In his twisted logic, he hadn't committed mass murder. He had eradicated poverty. He had solved a social problem with a final, horrific solution. His methods for dealing with dishonest merchants were just as direct. The merchants of Saxon Transylvania, who had long exploited Wallachia's markets, were a particular target. He saw their price gouging and deceit not as business, but as an economic invasion. When they defied his trade laws, he didn't just fine them. He marched into their towns, rounded up the offending merchants, and impaled them in their own market squares. He would then sit down for a meal amidst the dying, a clear message to any survivor. This is what happens when you steal from my people. Your profit is not worth your life. But it was the act of impalement itself that was his true signature, his masterpiece of pain. To call it an execution is to fundamentally misunderstand its purpose. An execution is meant to end a life. Impalement was designed to prolong it, to turn the human body into a living monument of suffering. The process was a work of diabolical precision, a testament to a deep, practical understanding of human anatomy. There were two main methods. The most common involved a thick, sharpened stake, about the diameter of a man's arm, which was heavily greased. The victim was held down, and the stake was inserted into the rectum or vagina. It was not a quick thrust. It was a slow, deliberate process. The stake was then raised vertically, and the victim's own weight would do the rest. The key was to avoid piercing any vital organs immediately. A skilled executioner could guide the stake along the spinal column, missing the heart, the lungs, the liver. The rounded, greased tip would push the organs aside rather than tear through them. The victim would be alive, fully conscious, suspended between heaven and earth in a state of unimaginable agony. Birds might peck at their eyes, the sun would bake their skin, every breath, every slight movement would cause the stake to shift inside them, grinding against bone and tissue. Death would come slowly, sometimes taking 2 or 3 days, arriving in the form of dehydration, blood loss, shock, or infection. It was a public spectacle, a slow-motion dissection of a living human being, designed for maximum psychological impact on anyone who witnessed it. Vlad used this horrifying theater for any and all transgressions: lazy wives, unchaste women, corrupt officials, thieves. The punishment was often the same. There is a famous and possibly apocryphal story that perfectly encapsulates his philosophy. To test the absolute honesty he had instilled in his subjects, he placed a golden cup in the middle of the town square of Târgoviște. It was filled with fresh water from a spring. Anyone could drink from it, but no one was to steal it. The story goes that throughout the remainder of his reign, the golden cup remained untouched, gleaming in the sun, a silent testament to the terrifying effectiveness of his rule. The people were not honest because they were virtuous. They were honest because they knew the alternative was to die screaming on a stick for 3 days. This obsession with absolute control extended even to foreign diplomacy. In one of the most infamous episodes of his reign, 2 envoys from the Ottoman Sultan arrived at his court. When they appeared before him, they refused to remove their turbans, citing a sacred religious custom. To Vlad, this was not a matter of religious observance. It was an act of profound disrespect. He saw it as a challenge to his authority in his own court. He calmly told the envoys that if their custom was so important, he would be happy to help them strengthen it. He had his guards seize them and nail their turbans directly to their skulls with 3 large iron spikes. He then sent them, still alive, back to the Sultan with a simple message. This is how the Prince of Wallachia honors the customs of his enemies. It was an act of diplomatic terrorism, a calculated insult designed to provoke and to horrify. He was telling Mehmed the Conqueror, the most powerful man in the world, that he was not afraid, that the normal rules of engagement did not apply. He was declaring that his kingdom was a place where even the Sultan's representatives could be subjected to his grotesque brand of justice. Through these acts, Vlad wasn't just punishing individuals, he was conditioning an entire society. He was burning the possibility of dissent out of the collective consciousness. Every impaled merchant, every burning vagrant, every nailed turban was a lesson. It was a form of mass communication where the message was written in agony and broadcast through screams. He was transforming Wallachia from a fractured, backstabbing principality into a disciplined, obedient, and terrified state. He was building his house of order, and the mortar holding it all together was the undiluted, ever-present fear of the stake. The art of the stake was the art of control, and Vlad was its undisputed master. The nailed turbans were more than just a gruesome insult. They were a declaration of war. Vlad had spent years consolidating his power internally, forging his kingdom into an instrument of his will through systematic terror. Now, he was ready to turn that instrument outward, against the very empire that had held him captive as a boy. In the winter of 1461, he launched a shockingly audacious campaign. He crossed the frozen Danube River, deep into Ottoman territory, and began a lightning-fast rampage through what is now Bulgaria. He burned villages, poisoned wells, and slaughtered tens of thousands of people, both Turkish soldiers and Bulgarian civilians alike. This was not a conventional war of conquest. It was a campaign of annihilation, a scorched earth policy designed to create a wasteland of fear between his kingdom and the Sultan. He was not just defeating his enemies, he was erasing them. In a letter he later sent to the King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, seeking an alliance, Vlad boasted of his kills with a chilling bureaucratic precision. He wrote, "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young. We killed 23,884 Turks, without counting those whom we burned in homes or the Turks whose heads were cut by our soldiers." He even sent the Hungarian king 2 large bags filled with the severed ears, noses, and heads of his victims as proof of his success. He was treating human lives like items on a ledger, a macabre accounting of his bloody work. The Sultan, Mehmed II, the man who had conquered Constantinople, the most fortified city in the world, was enraged. This was not just a rebellion. It was a personal humiliation. The boy hostage he had once known, the brother of his favorite Radu, had spat in his face. In the spring of 1462, Mehmed assembled a colossal army, a force estimated to be over 90,000 strong, perhaps even larger. It was a magnificent war machine, dwarfing anything the tiny principality of Wallachia could ever hope to muster. Accompanying the Sultan was Vlad's own brother, Radu the Handsome, who the Sultan intended to install on the Wallachian throne as a puppet ruler. The invasion was not just a military operation, it was a public execution. Mehmed was not coming to defeat Vlad, he was coming to erase him. Vlad knew he could not meet this force on an open battlefield. To do so would be suicide. His army was small, perhaps numbering fewer than 30,000 men. He had to rely on the only advantages he had, his intimate knowledge of the Wallachian terrain and his boundless capacity for cruelty. He adopted a strategy of total guerrilla warfare. As the massive Ottoman army advanced, they found a desolate, hostile land. The villages were empty, the fields were burned, the water in the wells was poisoned with animal carcasses. Vlad's small, mobile units would strike from the shadows, hitting the Ottoman supply lines, launching surprise raids on foraging parties, and then melting back into the forests and swamps. He waged a war of attrition, not against the main body of the army, but against its stomach and its morale. He even employed biological warfare, reportedly sending people infected with leprosy, tuberculosis, and the bubonic plague into the Ottoman camps, disguised as Turkish soldiers to spread disease and paranoia. The Ottoman advance slowed to a crawl, the magnificent army bogged down in a land that seemed cursed, hunted by an enemy they could rarely see. The psychological climax of this campaign came with one of the most audacious and terrifying acts of Vlad's career: the legendary night attack on the Sultan's camp. On a moonless night, Vlad, disguised as a Turk, personally led a small contingent of his best soldiers, numbering around 7,000 men, and infiltrated the heart of the massive Ottoman encampment. Their objective was not to fight the army, but to assassinate the Sultan himself. They moved like ghosts through the camp, slitting throats and causing chaos before launching their main assault on what they believed was the Sultan's tent. A wave of panic and confusion swept through the Ottoman ranks. Soldiers, roused from their sleep, began fighting each other in the darkness, mistaking friend for foe. The camp dissolved into a maelstrom of friendly fire and terror. While Vlad's men failed to kill MacLeod, they had attacked the tent of two powerful viziers by mistake. The psychological damage was immense. The message was clear: no one was safe. Not even the Sultan, surrounded by nearly 100,000 of his best soldiers, was safe from the Impaler's wrath. The attack demonstrated a level of daring that bordered on madness, reinforcing Vlad's image as a ghostly, almost supernatural foe. But it was what the Ottoman army found next that finally shattered their will to fight. After the night attack, a shaken but determined Mehmed pushed his army onward toward Vlad's capital city, Târgovişte. He expected to find a fortified city, ready for a siege. Instead, he found something far more disturbing. About a mile outside the city, in a valley several kilometers long, the Sultan's advance guard came to a sudden halt. The air was thick with the stench of death. What they saw before them was not a city. It was a forest made not of trees but of corpses. Stretching for as far as the eye could see were thousands upon thousands of sharpened stakes, and on each stake was a body: men, women, and even children. These were the 20,000 Turkish and Bulgarian prisoners Vlad had captured during his winter campaign. He had saved them for this very moment. He had created a grotesque outdoor art installation of human suffering. It was a masterpiece of psychological horror, arranged with an artist's eye for detail. The stakes were of varying heights, with the tallest and most prominent reserved for the highest-ranking captives, their decaying bodies serving as a grisly honor guard. Crows and other carrion birds circled overhead, feasting on the dead. The entire valley was a silent, stinking testament to one man's boundless cruelty. This was the infamous Forest of the Impaled. The effect on the battle-hardened Ottoman army was immediate and devastating. These were soldiers who had seen the horrors of war, who had stormed the walls of Constantinople. But they had never seen anything like this. This was not warfare. This was a vision from hell itself. The sheer scale, the methodical organization, the absolute madness of it all broke them. Even Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror of worlds, was profoundly shaken. The chronicles report that he stared in stunned silence for a moment before admitting, "How can we despoil of his estates a man who is not a man but a devil, who is not afraid to perform such deeds?" The Forest of the Impaled was Vlad's ultimate psychological weapon. It wasn't meant to kill soldiers, it was meant to kill their courage. It was a message, delivered not with words, but with 20,000 rotting corpses that said, "I am not like you. The rules of man do not apply to me. I will do things you cannot even comprehend to defend this land." The Ottoman army, already weakened by guerrilla attacks and disease, lost its will to continue. The campaign was over. A shaken Mehmed II ordered a retreat, leaving the task of hunting Vlad to his brother, Radu. In the wake of this horrifying spectacle, other stories began to circulate, blurring the line between strategic cruelty and outright insanity. It was said that Vlad would often dine amongst the dying in his forest of stakes, dipping his bread into the blood that dripped down from the bodies above. Whether this is literal truth or propaganda is impossible to know, but it speaks to the reputation he had cultivated. He was no longer just a prince. He was the Impaler Lord, a ghoul who feasted on terror, a man who had stared into the abyss of human cruelty and made it his home. He had defeated the world's greatest army not with steel, but with a nightmare. The Forest of the Impaled was Vlad's masterpiece of horror, a victory so absolute it seemed to defy the laws of warfare. He had turned back the world's mightiest army, but in doing so, he had also revealed the depths of his own madness. The psychological weapons that were so effective against his foreign enemies proved to be a double-edged sword. He had become a figure of such profound terror that even his allies began to see him not as a defender of Christendom, but as a liability, a rabid dog that was just as likely to bite the hand that fed it. His triumph was the beginning of his end. While Sultan Mehmed had retreated, he left Vlad's younger brother, Radu the Handsome, behind with a contingent of Turkish soldiers and a tempting offer for the Wallachian nobility. Radu was handsome, charming, and promised peace and stability. He was the antithesis of Vlad's reign of terror. The boyars who had been cowed into submission by Vlad now faced a choice: continue to serve a volatile, terrifying master who dined amongst the dead, or swear fealty to a prince who offered a return to normalcy, backed by the might of the Ottoman Empire. One by one, they began to defect to Radu's side. Vlad's brutal efficiency had secured their obedience, but it had never earned their loyalty. The fear he had so expertly cultivated could hold them in check, but it couldn't inspire them to fight for him when a viable alternative appeared. Vlad's other great hope was an alliance with the king of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus. He had sent the king letters, boasting of his slaughter of the Turks and begging for aid to continue the fight. But Matthias was a pragmatist. He had his own political troubles and was wary of being drawn into a full-scale war with the Ottomans over a prince who was rapidly gaining a reputation for demonic cruelty. Worse still, damning stories about Vlad were beginning to spread like wildfire across Europe, particularly in the German lands. This was the dawn of a new age of information, the age of the printing press, and Vlad the Impaler became one of history's first viral villains. German pamphlets filled with lurid woodcut illustrations began to circulate, detailing his alleged atrocities in sensational detail. They told stories that went far beyond his political punishments, painting him as a bloodthirsty sadist who killed for pleasure. They described him boiling people alive, forcing mothers to eat their own roasted children, cutting off the breasts of women and forcing their husbands to eat them, and countless other acts of unspeakable depravity. How much of this was true and how much was exaggerated propaganda is still debated by historians. The stories were likely fueled by the Saxon merchants he had so brutally punished, who now had their revenge through the power of the press. But the truth of the stories was irrelevant. What mattered was their impact. These pamphlets created an image of Vlad not as a harsh but effective ruler, but as a non-human monster, a wutrick, bloodthirsty tyrant, a devil walking the earth. This narrative was incredibly useful for his enemies. For Matthias Corvinus, it provided the perfect excuse to abandon him. In 1462, instead of marching to Vlad's aid, Matthias Corvinus had him arrested. Using forged letters that suggested Vlad was secretly plotting to betray the Hungarians and join the Ottomans, a deeply ironic accusation, Matthias imprisoned him. The great Impaler Lord, the man who had terrified the Sultan, was captured not in battle, but through political treachery, the very sin he despised above all others. He would spend the next 12 years as a political prisoner in Hungary, a dragon in a cage. His life did not end there. In a strange twist of fate, he was eventually released, regained the throne of Wallachia for a brief period in 1476. But his time was over. The political landscape had changed. He was a relic of a bygone era of brutality. In December of that same year, he was killed in battle against the Ottomans. The circumstances of his death are as murky as his life. One account says he was killed by his own men who mistook him for a Turk. Another, more likely story, is that he was overwhelmed and killed by Ottoman soldiers who then beheaded him. His head, preserved in honey, was sent to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople, where it was impaled on a stake and displayed above the city gates, a final, fittingly gruesome end for the Impaler Lord. His body was said to have been buried at a monastery in Snagov, an island near Bucharest. But when archaeologists opened his supposed tomb in the 1930s, they found it empty, save for a few animal bones. The devil had vanished, leaving only his terrifying legend behind. And what a legend it became. For centuries, Vlad was remembered in two starkly different ways. In Romania, he was mythologized as a national hero, a harsh but just ruler, a founding father who brought order to a chaotic land and stood defiantly against foreign invaders. The stories of his cruelty were seen as necessary evils, the tough actions of a strong leader protecting his people. He was Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. But in the West, thanks to the German pamphlets, his name became synonymous with pure evil. He was the monster from the dark woods of the East. And then, in 1897, an Irish author named Bram Stoker, while researching Eastern European folklore at the British Museum, stumbled upon the name Dracula. He likely knew very little about the historical Vlad III, perhaps only that he was a cruel prince from a land rumored to be home to vampires. But the name itself was perfect. It sounded dark, powerful, aristocratic. Stoker borrowed the name and a few scant details and grafted them onto his own creation, a suave, undead count. The historical Vlad the Impaler, the man who dined amidst a forest of corpses and nailed turbans to the heads of envoys, was gone. In his place stood Count Dracula, a creature of Gothic, romance, and supernatural horror. This is the ultimate irony of Vlad's legacy. A man who spent his life fighting against the Turks, a defender of Christendom, has been forgotten. The national hero of Romania has been overshadowed. His real-life atrocities, which were rooted in the brutal politics of his time, have been replaced by the fictional evil of a vampire. We have traded the terrifying, complex reality of a human monster for the comfortable, simple fantasy of a supernatural one. It's easier to believe in a creature that can be defeated with a wooden stake to the heart than it is to confront the chilling truth that the greatest monsters are not creatures of the night. They are men, forged in the fires of betrayal and chaos, who discover that the most effective tool for shaping the world is not hope or faith or love, but fear. So, who was Vlad the Impaler? Was he the romanticized, caped vampire of Gothic literature? Number. That is a fiction, a comfortable ghost story that allows us to forget the man. Was he the national hero of Romania, the stern but just father of his country who did what was necessary to forge a nation from chaos and blood? Perhaps in the eyes of some, history is often a matter of perspective, and for a nation fighting for its very existence, a savior and a monster can look terrifyingly alike. Or was he the Wuttrik, the bloodthirsty tyrant of the German pamphlets? A deranged sadist who killed for pleasure, a devil in human form whose cruelty knew no bounds. The evidence of his life certainly gives that interpretation a chilling weight. The terrifying truth is that he was all of these, and none of them. Vlad III Dracula was not a simple character. He was a product. He was a mirror, reflecting the savage brutality of the 15th century. He was a man forged in the crucible of betrayal, who learned from his captors, his enemies, and his own family that power was a zero-sum game, and mercy was a fatal weakness. He did not invent cruelty, but he perfected it. He industrialized it. He turned it from a simple act of violence into a sophisticated instrument of psychological warfare, political consolidation, and foreign policy. The Forest of the Impaled was not the work of a mere madman. It was the work of a political artist whose medium was human agony. The nailed turbans were not just an act of brutality, they were a calculated act of diplomatic terrorism. The golden cup left untouched in the square was not a symbol of an honest populace, but a monument to a society held in the grip of absolute, paralyzing fear. Vlad's story is a chilling reminder of a timeless and uncomfortable truth. Order and chaos are often separated by a single determined man willing to go further than anyone else. He was a physician who diagnosed his kingdom with the cancer of betrayal and corruption and chose to cure it with a bonfire. He burned away the disease, but he took the patient with it, leaving behind a nation that was orderly, disciplined, and utterly soulless. His legacy teaches us that the line between a strong leader and a brutal tyrant is terrifyingly thin. It reminds us that when we give our leaders the power to protect us from our enemies, we often give them the power to destroy us as well. The monsters of history are rarely born in a vacuum. They are created by our desperation. They rise to power on the promise of simple, final solutions to complex problems. Walter Freeman promised to cure the mind with an ice pick. Vlad the Impaler promised to cure his nation with a sharpened stake. Both left behind a trail of empty shells. The stories of Vlad the Impaler have been deliberately obscured, sanitized into a vampire myth, or polished into a heroic epic. The raw, unfiltered horror of what he truly was, a brilliant, strategic, and profoundly damaged human being who weaponized terror, is a history that many would prefer we forget. But we cannot afford to forget, because the ghost of Vlad the Impaler doesn't haunt the misty castles of Transylvania. It haunts the halls of power. His methods, stripped of their medieval props, are still with us. The use of public horror to control a population, the weaponization of fear to silence dissent, the justification of absolute brutality in the name of national security. These are not relics of the 15th century. They are headlines in the 21st. The story of Vlad the Impaler is not just a dark chapter from a forgotten age. It is a warning. It is a reminder that the capacity for such organized cruelty lies dormant within the human condition, waiting for the right mixture of fear, chaos, and a leader ruthless enough to unleash it. History is filled with uncomfortable truths. Our mission here is to drag them out of the shadows and into the light, not for shock, but for education. Because only by understanding the monsters of the past can we hope to recognize them when they walk among us again. If you believe that these dark histories need to be told, that we must remember in order to prevent, then join us. Subscribe. Share this story. And in the comments below, let us know which other chapter of suppressed history you think the world needs to hear. Because forgetting the devil is the surest way to invite him back.